Elias crouched in the watchroom at the top of the lighthouse, his knees pressed against the peeling green paint along the window ledge. The old lamp's rotating beams swept across the dark sea, and each pulse of light made him twitch. On calm nights, the ocean appeared still, almost welcoming. But tonight, the waves rippled with silver crests where the moonlight kissed them. It was ethereal in its beauty, yet unnerving in its endless vastness. Elias clutched his hands together until his knuckles whitened, trying to still the tremor in his fingers. He had lived in the lighthouse for so many years that the concept of time itself felt shapeless. Days blurred into nights, and nights bled back into days with only the measured tasks of survival marking any passage. He survived mostly on fish he caught from the jagged rocks at the base of the lighthouse. Sometimes he would net more than he needed. Other times it'd be days before he caught anything substantial, which never bothered him anymore. Hunger had become part of him, just as the constant chill in his bones had. Below the watchroom was the caretaker's chamber, a small, cramped living space, so damp and cold that moss grew along one of the cracks in the stone. A single cot, a chipped wooden table, and a tattered armchair comprised nearly all of his belongings. The rest of the space was cluttered with fishing nets, buoy fragments, and battered lanterns. Outside, the wind howled with sorrow, rattling the glass windows. But even at its most furious, the wind felt like the gentlest sound compared to the haunting cries that serenaded him in recent weeks. At first, he'd told himself it was only the gulls, or perhaps just his imagination. Then, as the days passed, he'd hear it again, faint wailing, carried by the wind as if belonging to souls lost at sea. He'd shut his eyes tightly when it happened, covering his ears with calloused hands. The calls always cut through him like a blade. That night, a stronger gust battered the tower. Elias exhaled shakily, stood up, and paced around the weathered desk. Once, this area had stored logbooks for ships passing the bay, but now it held only his diaries, filled with desperate scrawls. The knowledge that these diaries were the one place he had ever tried to speak the truth about the past made him loath to look at them. He fought the urge to descend to his chamber and hide. Instead, he forced himself to step onto the narrow balcony circling the tower. Salt-laden air whipped at his face. He clenched the iron railing as the lighthouse's beam arced overhead. The surf below crashed relentlessly against frightful stone pillars that had doomed countless passing vessels. And it was in that thunderous roar he once again heard it, the cry. It started low, like the whining of an injured pup, and then it rose in pitch, echoing across the water. Elias's breath caught. He turned, searching for any tangible shape in the darkness. A boat? A silhouette? Anything. There was nothing but the swirling sea, yet the cries lingered and reverberated against the stark walls of memory. Guilt lurked in those echoes, whispering that he hadn't done enough. He clamped his eyes shut. Time blurred. He found himself gripping the railing until his hands bled. He staggered back, stumbling across the doorway. Inside, he slammed the heavy wooden door to shut out the wind and the sound that hounded him. Down in the old service chamber, he lit an oil lamp and settled into his armchair. Battered in places where the fabric had ripped away, shadows flickered across the stones. He tried to drown his senses in the lamplight's glow, scanning the room to ensure no phantom lurked there. But his efforts were in vain. In the hush, there was a faint drip of salt water from the worn cracks in the walls, and amidst that faint drip, he imagined he still heard the sea's wail. He let out a shaky breath and forced himself to open one of the diaries on the table. The earliest pages were from years ago, when Elias first arrived as a fisherman lighthouse caretaker. The writing was neat, methodical. The lamp requires checks twice a day. The storms are rough. The fish are plentiful. As the pages went on, the penmanship devolved into scratchy scrawls, across which were words like dreams and voices. And then he reached the differently colored pages, those from the night of the tragedy, scribbled in dark ink. The words fluttered on the edge of his mind. We left the harbor determined to prove them wrong. The sea roared, but we laughed in its face. He snapped the diary shut. A sharp pang shot through his chest. Within him the memory stirred. Many years ago, Elias had captained a small fishing vessel. He had a crew of 3 close friends. They braved a sudden storm because the catch that day was the largest they'd seen in months. Greed and overconfidence pushed them beyond caution. The storm battered the deck, water crashed over the bow, and the wave that struck them at dusk was unstoppable. He alone remembered the jolt as the vessel capsized, water flooding everything, and his frantic attempts to keep afloat. He remained conscious even as darkness took them all, and he alone had washed ashore, half dead, on the jagged rocks beneath the lighthouse at sunrise. The caretaker who once tended this place found him, nursed him back to some semblance of physical health. But the caretaker eventually left 3 months after Elias's arrival, could not endure the gloom, the relentless storms banging against the tower, or Elias's ever-growing ghosts. Since then, Elias had chosen to remain. He never expected the dead to call him so tangibly. Clawing at his mind each night, a sudden reverse in the wind rattled the structure like a drum. He blinked, startled. The lamp's flame guttered. He nudged the diaries away and tried to settle his heart. When he could no longer bear the suffocating stillness, he stood and began methodically checking cupboards and shelves, for no real reason other than to keep himself busy. He found half a loaf of stale bread wrapped in cloth, and a chunk of equally stale cheese. He broke off bits, chewing and scarcely tasting. Outside, the wind moaned once more. Then, "Help," came a voice, faint but clear. Elias froze, the bread falling from his hand onto the floor. His temples pounded. He pressed against the wall as if to meld into the cold stone, his breathing ragged. Had he imagined that, or was danger truly out there? Curiosity and dread locked horns in his mind. He picked up his lantern, each step up the winding stairs heavier than the last. The cry came again, and this time it was unmistakable. It sounded close. At the top he ventured onto the balcony once more. Rain pelted down, though scarcely more than a drizzle. The beam of the lighthouse swept across the water. He scanned the black expanse but detected no figure, no boat. Nonetheless, the voice called again, closer than ever. Elias's pulse thundered in his ears. He leaned over the railing, and that was when he saw it, a flicker of movement bobbing near the base of the rocky cliff. It was something pale, flailing in the water, a shape that could be an arm. Even as fear coiled in his belly, Elias rushed back down the staircase, down past the living quarters, and further to a rusted door leading outside. The wind seized him, an icy gale that whipped his hair back. Waves slammed at the foot of the lighthouse, swirling around step-like rocks. His boots slipped on seaweed as he carefully navigated the path. "Hello?" he shouted into the stormy darkness. "I'm here! I'm coming!" He brandished his lantern high, its flame flickering in the spray of salt water. Reality and memory collided in his mind. He was plunging into water. He was saving someone. Was he drowning again? The old panic seized him. Still, he edged closer to the waterline. Another wave crashed against the stones, drenching him. He blinked through salt-laced coldness, then glimpsed a figure thrashing in the water. Before he could think, he wedged the lantern into a crevice, dove onto his stomach across the slimy rocks, and reached out a trembling hand. Fingers grazed his. For a moment, he nearly pulled the figure to him. Then a wave slammed against them, forcing them apart. Elias cried out, lunged again. But the ocean was violent, churning and merciless. The person's pale face contorted in panic before it sank beneath the black water. "No, no!" he muttered. He scrambled forward, leaning so far off the rock that his ribs pressed painfully against the ledge. He tried to grab the pale arm that surfaced one last time, but another surge soaked him, and he lost his grip. Hissing in frustration, he nearly slipped into the water himself. Then the figure was pulled under. Elias at last staggered back, chest heaving. The ocean quieted, as though it had never been disturbed at all. The only noise was his pulse thudding in his ears and the faint, ever-present wind. Lantern in hand, he trudged back up the steps, completely drenched. In the moonlight, he checked the shoreline. Nothing but swirling froth. Shivering, he returned inside, each footstep echoing in the desolate corridor. Up in his chamber, he peeled off his soaked clothing. His body was ice cold. He couldn't stop shaking. Lingering dread told him he had, once more, watched a life vanish without being able to save it. Great waves of guilt and sorrow battered him from within. Eventually, he collapsed into an uneasy sleep. Dreams assailed him, the cacophony of a thunderous sea, the faces of his lost friends, arms outstretched, voices calling him. He woke to his own screams. Light leaked through the lone window. Morning. Newly formed puddles dotted the chamber where water had pooled from his soaked clothes. Groaning, Elias rose from the cot. A deep ache throbbed in his muscles and bones. Even so, he forced himself to the watchroom, ignoring the hunger in his stomach. He had to see if daybreak revealed any wreckage or sign of a body. With the lamp extinguished, the sun being bright enough, he peered through the spyglass he kept on a dusty shelf. A rough sea, but no debris, no body, no sign of the figure. Likely the tide had carried it away. The same tortured feeling that had haunted him for years burrowed even deeper into his heart. His imagining or not, another soul had been lost. He had failed again. Over the following days, a chilling hush replaced the cries. Elias might have preferred the wailing, for that at least gave him a target for his anxiety. A question gnawed at him. If someone had truly been there, what had become of them? Without closure, guilt festered like a wound. He performed his task of lighting the beacon each sunset, scrawling truncated thoughts in his diaries. He also found himself pacing more, casting uneasy glances at the door to the outside. Over and over, he replayed that moment when he had grasped the stranger's fingers. Then, in the middle of a particularly dark night, he woke from a dream and heard soft sobbing. He shot upright in his cot. The flame in his oil lamp had almost guttered out, leaving everything in half light. Another gush of wind rattled the windows, but in between those gusts he heard it again. Not the gulls, not just the sea, but a low sobbing. And it was inside the lighthouse. Instantly awakened, he grabbed the storm lantern from the table and lit it, stifling a rising sense of panic. "Who's there?" His voice echoed, but no answer came, yet the sobbing continued, coaxing him out of the chamber and up the spiral stairs. Each step threatened to crumble beneath him, or so it felt. The air grew thick, oppressive. Water dripped from overhead, forming small puddles on each landing. At the next level, an empty storeroom, the sobbing grew louder. He pushed open the door. Bins and crates, some overturned, lined the walls. A few had collapsed in coastal storms that had shaken the structure over the years. But he was sure the sound originated from somewhere within these shadows. Panting, he edged forward, the lantern illuminating a small circle of light around him. He paused near a large crate. The sobbing abruptly stopped. Elias's heart hammered. Then, from behind the crate, something lunged at him. He stumbled backward with a gasp, nearly dropping the lantern, but there was no assailant, no monstrous figure. Only a damp, half-rotted tarp flopping to the ground. A trick of his imagination, or perhaps a stray gust from a hidden crack in the wall. Adrenaline pounded in his veins. He scoured every inch of the storeroom. Empty. Dust and sea salt on every surface. No living soul. Pretending calm, he set the lantern on a crate. His reflection in its glass was pale, ghost-like. Slowly, he slid to the floor, head in his hands. Perhaps he was losing his grip entirely. As his breathing slowed, a single tear slipped down his cheek. Then, out of nowhere, he heard footsteps, soft, tentative, coming from the staircase above. He froze, every muscle rigid. The footsteps turned into a shuffle, as if someone was dragging a wounded leg. Elias's stomach twisted. He rose, retrieving his lantern. Fire's lamp held forward. He climbed the stairs that led to the watchroom. A figure stood in the corner, shoulders hunched. It was a man, drenched clothes clinging to his spindly frame, hair dripping salt water. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the man's face, one of his sunken crew, a friend who'd been lost to the storm. The friend lifted his gaze, eyes hollow. His lips parted, but no words came. Instead, water dribbled down his chin. An unspeakable chill poured through Elias's veins. He wanted to shout, to flee, but instead found himself rooted in place. The figure took a trembling step forward, leaving watery footprints on the dusty floor. Even in the gloom, Elias could see the bruises around the man's neck from the rope that had once snapped in the gale. He recalled that horrifying moment from the wreck, how the rigging had whipped around, tangling limbs and capturing them all in chaos. Now that memory was a living nightmare. "You left us," the figure rasped, voice rattling. "Why?" Elias shook his head, fear and sorrow wrestling in his eyes. You know I tried." The figure's eyes showed no compassion, only betrayal. On impulse, Elias advanced, as if to grab his old friend's shoulder, but his hand met only cold, damp air. The man dissipated into swirling mist. Elias collapsed to his knees, a raw sound escaping him. He slapped the floor in frustration, trying to prove it was real, that he wasn't going mad. The footsteps echoed once more before fading entirely. He stayed kneeling there, dazed for a long time. Eventually he returned to the caretaker's chamber, not knowing whether it was day or night. He had no desire to check. His mind buzzed with illusions, regrets, half-formed nightmares. At some point he fell into fitful sleep, and upon waking, he decided something had to be done. He could no longer endure being trapped in his own guilt and horror. Clutching a battered old cloak around his shoulders, Elias stepped outside at dawn. The sky was gray with the promise of another tempest, but the tides were briefly calmer. For the first time in years, he walked away from the lighthouse's immediate perimeter, down the rocky path that led toward the mainland. He had no clear plan, only the desperate urge to find some piece of his old life, some solace beyond these walls. The path cut along steep cliffs pounded by the surf below. Sharp sea air invaded his lungs. He shivered, remembering his carefree youth in the fishing village years ago, when the sea was both a livelihood and an old friend. Carefully he picked his way along the narrow route until he reached a cluster of dunes. There he paused. It had begun to drizzle. The distant roofs of the village were barely discernible through the haze. His breathing grew shallow. Did he truly want to go back? To face the families of the men he'd lost? Thunder rumbled in the distance, snapping him out of his hesitation. Drenched by the drizzle, he continued, only to skid on loose gravel and tumble onto his hands and knees. Sand stung his palms. The sky darkened with incredible speed as the storm advanced. Suddenly the wind gained force and a wave of panic crashed through him unbidden. He struggled to his feet, but the memory of that ill-fated night barreled into him. The howling wind, the driving rain, the monstrous waves. He saw again the faces of his crew, heard their screams. The voices screeched in his head. The fisherman pinned his hands over his ears, but the wind roared louder. The ocean thundered, and every part of him felt suffocated by ghosts and sorrow. "You left us," they cried. "Why didn't you save us?" His chest seized. Warm tears slid down his face, mixing with the rain. He turned around, stumbling back toward the lighthouse. The storm soared above, lashing him with sheets of rain. Darkness descended, piling on the dread. It was as though the sea itself laughed at his torment, condemning him to remain in that lonely tower forever. He reached the base of the lighthouse, panting, soaked to the bone. Part of him wanted to tear open the door, race to the top, extinguish that cursed light, and let the structure collapse into ruin. Another part of him whispered that he was too weak. Either way, he had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. Inside, he lit a lantern with shaking hands. The storm raged beyond the walls. To quell his mounting terror, he yanked open the diaries he'd so often avoided, flipping to the pages detailing the night of the shipwreck. Our boat took the wave broadside. I lost my grip on the helm. Water sprang in from everywhere. I tried to cut the rigging, but it tangled. Gideon smashed his head on the bulkhead. I saw them slip away. I can't sleep. Their faces are with me. I'm not sure how I survived. His tears spilled onto the pages, ink bleeding in black smudges. In a trembling hand, he continued writing. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I tried." His pen scratched violently. A wave of anguish overtook him, and he found himself screaming. The wind howled in response. At that moment, a bolt of lightning illuminated the watchroom windows. Thunder shook the tower to its mortar. By reflex, Elias sprang up, the diary scattering. The door behind him slammed open. Wind rushed in. There, silhouetted in a flash of lightning, stood the figure of the drowned man again, his friend. Water streamed from his hair and clothes, forming a pool around him. Then another shape emerged. Another friend. Chest caved in from being thrown against the wooden mast. A third shape, too. Their eyes glowed with vacant sorrow, arms outstretched in silent accusation. Elias's soul quaked beneath their stares. "I'm sorry," he begged. "I never meant for you to die." Rain lashed sideways through the open door, soaking the diaries that lay on the ground. Lightning flared, revealing the silent condemnation etched into their features. Outside, the sea roared. Its crashing wave battered the rocks. The spirits advanced. Elias's breath caught, and a wave of unstoppable panic seized him. Tears blurred his vision. Clutching the lantern, he raced up the last flight of stairs to the top of the tower. The ghosts were on his heels. Or, more accurately, inside him. In every corner of his consciousness. At the tower's peak, he thrust the trapdoor open. Fat raindrops pelted down as lightning illuminated the rotating beacon. He stood among the machinery, soaked by the deluge, blinking salt water off his lashes. Thunder erupted overhead. All at once, he dropped the lantern. Its glass shattered, the flame extinguishing in a hiss. Elias collapsed to his knees, gripping the iron frame that supported the lens. The wind pummeled him, keening through the broken windows. The ghosts gathered around him, 3 forlorn specters merging with the storm. Elias closed his eyes, speaking through clenched teeth. "Take me, if that's what you want. I can't live like this anymore. Please, let me rest." His plea carried desperation, a yearning to finally be freed from this eternal guilt. And in that moment, as lightning flickered, he realized the sea had quieted, just slightly. The thunder rolled softly into the distance. Opening his eyes, he saw the 3 figures in front of him, their mouths parted, yet no sound emerged. One ghost slowly lifted a hand, placing it on Elias's shoulder. Its touch was neither warmth nor cold, but something beyond sensation. Tears coursed down Elias's cheeks. He did not hear their voices, but something in their expressions began to shift. The hostility, the betrayal, the anguish, layers peeled away. In the hush of the storm's lull, Elias sensed an unspoken absolution. This was no forgiveness from them, nor from an external force. It was a reminder that, although he couldn't change the past, he had survived. They were gone, and they would remain gone. Perhaps the best case was to honor their memory and seek a life beyond the prison of blame that bound him. Slowly, Elias lifted his head, meeting their gazes. His breathing steadied. With careful resolve, he pressed a hand over where the specter had touched his shoulder. "If I live on," he whispered, voice almost lost in the wind, "I'll carry you with me, not in guilt, but in remembrance." Thunder cracked, but its echo was faint this time. The figures began to fade, reduced to dancing motes of sea spray. Their eyes lingered on him, a hollow farewell. Then they vanished, leaving only Elias's ragged breathing and the drenched emptiness of the watchroom. For some time he knelt there, water dripping from every seam of his clothing. The swirling arc of the beacon continued uninterrupted. Waves crashed below. Gradually he found the strength to stand. He set about adjusting the lamp's mechanism for the night, ensuring the lights moving with purpose. He descended the tower, ignoring the water tracks so many footsteps, real or imagined, had left behind. His diaries lay scattered and sodden, ink running. He gathered them gently, placed them near the fireplace in his chamber, and then worked to stoke a fire in the old hearth. Once a faint flame emerged, he sat on the floor, hugging his knees as warmth slowly seeped into his chilled limbs. The wind outside softened into a low moan. The ocean lapped against the rocks, tireless, but not quite so menacing to his ears. Elias's heart still bore the weight of sorrow, yet a single thread of relief mingled with it. Whatever illusions he had seen, or voices he had heard, they had forced him to confront the memories he had locked away. and though the hurt remained, it felt just a little bit less paralyzing than before. Tomorrow morning, when the sea was calm, he would venture beyond the lighthouse again. Maybe he would go to the village to offer his apologies, or perhaps he would hand over a letter or a diary page to the families of the lost men, explaining a piece of the sorrow he still carried for them. If he couldn't earn forgiveness, he could at least let them know he had never forgotten. For now, the steady rhythm of the lighthouse beacon above comforted him. He listened to the crackle of the small fire, letting it ease the chill from his bones. Exhaustion gradually weighed his eyelids closed, and for the first night in more years than he could recall, he drifted to sleep without the cries of the sea echoing through his mind, uncertain but hopeful that the dawn would bring some semblance of peace.